Hello everybody, it's your boy Jmulls of Jmulls Gaming here today to talk more about Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. Let's talk about some of the issues, shall we? And let's focus primarily today on the FPS. What is FPS? A lot of people talk about it when it comes to games. What is it? We should probably establish some ground rules first. FPS stands for frames per second. Why do people talk about FPS so much when it comes to games? Why do these frames that you see per second matter so much when it comes to games? Because movies and animation utilize FPS, but it's largely never talked about in those mediums, but is brought up constantly for games. And why is that? And there's a very particular reason. And I'm going to leave a link in the description down below to a video by TotalBiscuit, who really summarized this whole FPS situation when it comes to video games very eloquently. And he managed to do this over 8 years ago, back when this debate was barely even a debate. He's a real pioneer on this topic. And I want to talk about it within the modern context and with these Pokemon games specifically, because the conversation around the game's performance has kind of dominated this game's life so far. So, in the description down below for that video, watch it after this one, please. For Pokemon games that are known for being on the low end for graphical fidelity, why is this debate springing up? Why is it seemingly taking such a hold on so many people? Well, in my opinion, it's a couple of things. Yes, movies and animation use FPS, but it's largely a visual component there, and they have other movie-making tricks up their sleeve to masquerade the FPS. And the FPS that is used, I believe 24 is the standard in Hollywood, some studios differ a little bit. It's used to create a certain visual effect for the viewer, because they're not interacting with the movie. There's no button input you go to the cinema for, right? But in an interactive medium like video games where the player has direct control over what happens on the screen, FPS has another purpose: interactivity. If you have more frames, that's more frames that you can interact with. If you're a fan of Summoning Salt, who does a lot of summaries on big speed running topics in the community for various games, you have probably heard the bus stop analogy, especially if you watch the Mario videos. And think of each frame as a train, and when you arrive at the station, you can get on the next train that departs, but you can't get on the last one. So if I press a button, right, say I want to walk forward, and I hit the stick to go forward. Or, no, better yet, say I want to hit the X button. So I hit the X button. If I press a button right after a frame is shown, I have to wait for the next frame to see the result of my button press. Obviously, input lag notwithstanding. So if there are more frames and they are decently spaced apart, then I end up waiting less time for the next train, quote-unquote, frame to see the result of my button press. Now, some games and some controls and some setups like streaming a game might increase the input lag, but you're still waiting at the end of all that input lag for the next frame to show up to see the result of your button input. And by having more frames, which means if the game is remotely well optimized, so those frames are tightly packed together within that 1 second, and they evenly spaced apart, the more frames you have, it can make a game feel more responsive, which is particularly valuable for a game that utilizes fast responses when it comes to its gameplay. Take an FPS game like Call of Duty, Halo, or Apex, or a fighting game, or really all games that play in real time. And I'd also argue, like TotalBiscuit does, even for games that aren't that fast-paced, like turn-based games, even card games like Hearthstone, you notice these frames. In games like that, it feels more responsive to be able to interact with the game as close to a button press as you can. It makes the visual experience also look smoother and not as almost jagged, if that makes sense. But this is a Pokemon video, as I'm sure you're aware by watching the subpar gameplay that I'm probably putting out here. And Pokemon isn't a real-time game, so why the debate? I mean, the game hardly relies on those fast button inputs. It's turn-based and more tactical. You take your time, make a decision, you press a button, and then watch the animation play out and wait for your opponent to press a button. So, does that mean that FPS has no gameplay advantage in a turn-based game like Pokemon? Well, yes and no. It kind of depends on your perspective. There's a difference between a preference and an objective reality, and that's an important ground rule we really need to establish moving forward here. Because a lot of times people mix up these two and when they apply. What's a preference and what's a fact? Whether or not you like a higher FPS value in a game, that is a preference. For whatever reason you dare choose or you have, Whether or not you like a higher FPS value in a game, that's entirely an opinion, and that is an opinion that you yourself must form. But whether or not a higher FPS value changes the way you play a game, that isn't. Or let me clarify a little bit, how you interact with the game. That isn't. And for me, when it comes to turn-based games like Pokemon, it comes down more to preference. Will watching sprites that are 5 feet or more away from me and have them look like a PowerPoint presentation bother you? It may be yes, and it may be no. That is up to you. It might break your immersion. It does for me. It could cause you to laugh. Sometimes I laugh at the windmill or something. Or you could simply not care about it. I know there's a lot of people out there that just simply don't care about it. For me, I notice it. It bothers me. But it doesn't bother me to the point where I no longer enjoy the game. And that is an important distinction to make, because a lot of the times on the internet, we like to fall into these binary arguments where this flaw, or quote-unquote criticism, either breaks the game and makes it unplayable, or is completely negligent and doesn't matter in the slightest. And I don't feel like you can really talk about game critique in that predefined binary of breaking the game or being inconsequential. Because I am really enjoying the gameplay that is there with Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. I think gameplay-wise, there's a ton of great going on there. I'm not that far into the game, I swapped over to Violet. But, of what I've played so far, it's probably one of my favorite Pokemon games in terms of the gameplay and the content that is there for generations. Would I prefer the game to run better and to look better? Absolutely. And these issues deserve to be talked about. It's what I'm trying to do right now, but I'm trying to do it in a reasonable way, at least. You can love and enjoy a game while still criticizing it and wanting it to be better. It's not some kind of sports team that you feel obligated to support, even during the bad times. You are allowed to have opinions and to express them. Now, I have stated that Pokemon is a turn-based game, obviously. But is it, though? Because it's not entirely true when you really start to think about it. And I tend to find when a lot of people, including myself sometimes, have this discussion, the overworld and the exploration in a Pokemon game is largely ignored, especially in recent games. When in Scarlet and Violet, it's a rather large component. Now, granted, I haven't actually experienced all that many issues that impeded my gameplay with the open world, so my experience hasn't been that negatively affected by the game's performance in that regard. But it might for you, and again, it comes down to your preference. Do you like that higher frame? How big of a cutoff, how big of a non-negotiable is that consistent FPS for you as a player for a game like Pokemon? That comes down to the personal experience and your own personal preferences. But I want to take a minute to talk about, would a higher frame rate, say a consistent 60, make exploring the open world more enjoyable in Pokemon? For me, yes it would, because I like that smoother, more responsive experience when I'm trying to navigate an open world that comes with a higher frame rate. And again, we are assuming that the game's remotely coded competently, and the frames are decently spaced apart. Like I said before, we tend to talk extremes in the games industry, but while a higher FPS is my preference, like I said before, what is there, it's still fun and enjoyable, it's still playable to me. But the graphical fidelity and the FPS of sprites at a certain distance, it does affect my enjoyment. It just doesn't ruin it. The map being low FPS does affect my enjoyment. Navigating the world at a low FPS does affect my enjoyment of the open world. I would have a more pleasant experience, be more immersed in it, if the game looked better and, most importantly, ran better. Now, why does Pokemon have these issues? Okay, as a brief aside, this might be the most cursed video I've ever made, by the way. It's taken me multiple recordings, and I just freaking had, like, the last 3 minutes I just recorded muted. So, now that I have my little mini rant about how I can't hit the unmute button for some reason, why does Pokemon have these issues? Why does a series that sells so much and makes so much money have these issues, while other series just seemingly don't even have them? At least on the Switch. Well, it could be any number of issues. I'm not a developer, I'm not an expert in this field, so I can't tell you any specific reason. But like that one comment on a random TikTok that I've seen probably like a month or two ago that I don't even remember at this point, I don't need to be a farmer to know when the milk is spoiled. I'm not going to blame the hardware for problems that I largely only see from Pokemon on this consistent of a basis for this large of a series. I don't need to be an artist to differentiate a stick figure from a Van Gogh. Now, what could these issues be? I can only speculate. Could it be the amount of development time? Possibly. That is the problem that I probably lean towards the most. But in actuality, it's probably a combination of a few issues. But I feel like them just not having the time to develop these games and only having a year, if that, to develop these games, I feel like that's one of the core issues. Could it be in-house decisions with how they develop a Pokemon? Or code the game? Could be some engine problems happening? Possibly. But here's the important thing that I feel is lost in this discussion a lot of the times, especially on the internet. Do I think it's the consumer's fault? No. Do I think the consumer should care why the problem exists? No. Most consumers are only going to care that the problem exists. They're not going to care for the technical reason why it exists. Because to them, the only thing that matters is that the problem exists in the first place. And I can't fault them. It's not their job to develop or identify issues with the game after the release. That was up to the developers and the publisher to identify those pre-release and fix them. It's not up to the consumer to solve the game's issues. If the game needs more development time to put out a high-quality product, then personally I would be in favor of that. Cut the mid-generation remakes, and I know Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, or whatever it was called, was developed by a separate team, but Arceus released not too long ago. Or maybe the answer is to just give the developers more time and to space out the releases more. And if that would improve the development, whole workflow, and life, while also providing the consumer a better experience, and personally, I would be in favor of that. I don't know what the answer is, but again, it's not up to the consumer to identify what the problem is. All that we do know is if the goal is to make high-quality and polished Pokemon games, then the current methodology behind the creation and development of the games isn't working. But if the goal is to solely make money, and the product itself is secondary to that, then the current trajectory will more likely than not be maintained unless people en masse stop paying for the current quality of the product. Now, I've heard some takes that the series will make money regardless, so not buying it and boycotting the series won't do anything and is pointless. And maybe so. But like I said before, can we stop pretending that this crap is a binary? It's a spectrum of opinion. I enjoy the game. The gameplay loop of Pokemon is enjoyable for me. I like collecting Pokemon. I like training them, leveling them up, exploring the world, fighting all the gyms. I like that gameplay. And I love the gameplay additions that were brought in with Scarlet and Violet. The performance is an issue though. And to pretend that it's fine or satisfactory for a series of Pokemon's renown is woefully disingenuous in my opinion. And the people saying it's fine for them, so it's fine in period, baffle me personally and just feels selfish. The goal should be progression in the series, not stagnation or regression. The goal should be to have the option for a higher and more stable frame rate, so those who want it can have that option, while others who prefer graphical fidelity can have their option, giving the consumer, giving the player, more options with how they want to experience the game, in my opinion, unless it specifically goes against the artistic vision of the game, is never an issue. Is never a problem. I'm always going to be in favor of more options than not. So like I said, do I think the FPS or the performance of Pokemon Scarlet and Violet should be acceptable? No. That's my personal opinion. I feel it's way too poor of a showing for a series of Pokemon's renown. And seeing characters, like even in the classroom bit, at like 5 FPS is jarring and is not pleasant to look at. It takes you out of the experience. Seeing things off in the distance have very low FPS doesn't immerse me in the world, it doesn't make me want to explore the world. Having a bunch of bugs and glitches that directly interfere with my gameplay experience, like in the first cave, when you're escorting Miraidon through the cave, and you try and go get an extra Pokeball down a cave, and the game like swaps between every frame, whether or not you're doing the RP walk with Miraidon or sprinting, so you're just like stutter stepping, that interferes, that takes you out of it, that annoys the player. You can play and enjoy the game while also hoping for and expecting better from it. So I'm going to call the video there for the day. Thank you all for tuning in. Hope you enjoyed the video. Leave a comment down below with your thoughts on the performance for Scarlet and Violet. Does it break the game for you? Is it fine for you? Let me know. I want to hear your opinion and hear your thoughts and hear your perspectives. Thank you all for tuning in. When you're down there, please leave a like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out and helps support future content, and I greatly appreciate it. Stay safe out there, everybody. Have a great day, and I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye, everybody.